English friends, they even didn't know that we were deported to Russia.
You didn't want to tell them because they wouldn't understand, or they would laugh, so you just close yourself up.
West didn't want to know because the priority was to win the war, regardless of the price. You cannot blame them for that.
It would be fair for the Polish people who suffered so much to say that what was done was very wrong.
It's a history, it's important. One shouldn't hide the truth.
The Victory Parade in London. Britain celebrates the end of 6 years of horrific war. Polish soldiers who fought alongside their British and American allies are not invited to take part in the parade.
A victory parade, we didn't treat it as a victory parade. Of course, I don't even think that we are so much offended that Poles were not invited. At that time I was in Scotland, and it was not a victory for us.
Churchill said in the House of Commons, "The fate of Poland seems to be an unending tragedy, and we, who went to war all ill-prepared on her behalf, watch with sorrow the strange outcome of our endeavours." The strange outcome of the war, as Churchill put it, was that Polish troops and their families had no homes to go back to. They had to build up their lives anew, scattered around the world, over 110,000 people making their home in Britain. However, the reasons for this displacement are known in the West only to a very few. Not many people know that just 5 years earlier, most of the recruits to the Polish army were emaciated, exhausted, and bedraggled, like General Rakowski, the future hero of the Battle for Monte Cassino. This is the story of their Forgotten Odyssey. September the 1st, 1939, is known as the day of Hitler's attack on Poland, the day that triggered off the Second World War. The date September the 17th, 1939, is not so well remembered in the West. It was then that Poland suffered another blow. Soviet Russia, her other neighbor, attacked her unexpectedly from the east. This was a direct result of the secret protocol attached to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in which Germany and Russia divided Poland between themselves, to all intents and purposes, forever. Having occupied half of the Polish territory, the Soviets sought systematically to eliminate the Polish nation. To crush possible resistance, they arrested all the Polish officers they could find, whether serving or in reserve. At one stroke, Stalin was destroying the flower of Polish intelligentsia, professors, scientists, doctors, and artists. The Soviets now turned to the officers' families and the rest of the middle classes, as well as shop owners and landowners. Soon even whole villages were arrested for refusing to accept Soviet citizenship. No one was spared. All were taken and given just half an hour to pack their possessions. Halina Żywuszko was 13.
My sister had flu and they came to take us away. My mother was begging them to let her stay behind. She was worried about her. But the Russians didn't want to hear.
Around 1.7 million inhabitants of eastern Poland, not only Poles but also Jews, Belarusians and Ukrainians, were deported to the depths of Russia, into the unknown. Their only crime, they were Polish citizens. Janina Jorkiewicz, then 13, vividly remembers leaving Poland.
It was only at the station that we saw the full extent of the tragedy of our people. There were several sets of goods trains. Voices, questions and shouts were coming from inside. After some time, the train started and there was a great outpouring of the hymn, "We will not abandon our land," coming from all the trains. Everyone was crying, everyone was singing.
Wydobywał się z wszystkich pociągów. Wszyscy płakali, wszyscy śpiewali.
The The conditions in the train were inhuman.
And just normal cattle train, 60 to 70 people were pushed into one compartment. Of course, there were no beds. In the middle of that wagon, there was cast iron stove, and that's all what there was. There was no toilet. There was one opening little hole.
10-year-old Janina Kwiatkowska's journey started tragically.
On the way, my grandmother died. They threw her out into a ditch, and the train went on.
Several of people died because it was very cold. We were given very little food, some fish, and occasionally water. We had to melt the snow.
The Soviets sent Poland's civilian population to work at collective farms and in isolated settlements all over Siberia and northern Kazakhstan. Stefan Weidenfeld's odyssey started when he was 16.
After a week-long journey, we found ourselves in the forest, in the middle of nowhere, guarded by a single Soviet elderly policeman whose name was Borisov, and who guarded us with a rifle hanging on a string from his shoulder. There was no way of escaping, and we all had to work in the forest. We were sent there for re-education in physical work. And this was, of course, a lot of rubbish.
Majority of the people started working in gold mining pits. In the pit called Yuzhna, you used to work in water. They supplied you sort of the rubber overalls and gave you, regardless of your age or sex, gave you a glass of very strong vodka before you went there. Conditions were really, really harsh. I was working one of those as a 14-year boy, nearly 1,000 feet below the ground. So were the pregnant women, so were my mother.
Through our 2 years in Russia, we had formed a view that the population of the Soviet Union was clearly divided into the ruled and the rulers, and that the rulers led entirely different lives from the enormous, much greater part of the population who were the ruled and whose lives were miserable and difficult. And among them we found very many normal, pleasant, compassionate people.
On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler unexpectedly attacked the Soviet Union. Paradoxically, it was the moment which brought deliverance to thousands of Poles incarcerated all over the country. Following Churchill's advice, General Sikorski, Prime Minister of the Polish government, now based in London, signed a treaty with the Soviets, as a result of which Stalin agreed to an amnesty, a pardon for the Poles who were allowed to form an army. It was to join the fight against Hitler, now the common enemy. Leaving behind their places of confinement was by no means the end of their misfortunes. Janina's tragedy struck on her way south, to freedom.
W pewnym momencie pociąg w nocy, późnym wieczorem zatrzymuje się.
Suddenly, at night, the train stopped in the snowdrifts. And it turns out that, according to the train driver, the engine is broken and we have to wait all night. Around us is only snow. The temperature is minus 40 degrees. And in the distance, you could see the lights of a small village. The people were hungry and desperate. So they decided to go to that village to get some food. My mother was among them. When they were walking up to the waist in snow, the train suddenly started. There was great despair. the children cried, and I realized that this might be the last time I saw my mother. And that's what happened. I never saw her again. And I understood that I became the only person at the age of 13 who would take care of my brothers.
Jedynym opiekunem, mając 13 lat, moich braci.
Their odyssey went on relentlessly. Exhausted, bedraggled and lice-ridden, hundreds of thousands of those released from the camps and settlements were making their way from the remotest corners of Russia, determined to find their army. But the further south they came, the more they were struck by terrible epidemics, typhus, dysentery and malaria. Many thousands were buried by the roadside. The main army reception center for recruits was Buzowuk. Those lucky enough to reach it alive started intensive training. General Władysław Anders, himself recently released from a 2-year stay in Soviet prisons, was appointed commander-in-chief of the Polish army. These new soldiers had to be clothed, trained, and most immediately fed. Although the Soviet troop rations were inadequate, General Anders gave orders that they were to be shared amongst the masses of starving civilians. For women, children, and old people, finding their army became the only hope for survival. Then in 1942, General Anders persuaded Churchill to obtain Stalin's permission to let the Polish army leave the Soviet Union. Along with the troops, a number of soldiers' families were allowed out. By August 1942, 118,000 troops and 44,000 civilians had left the Soviet Union in 3 large convoys, to freedom, to Persia. They crossed the Caspian Sea in overcrowded Soviet tankers. But not everyone was lucky enough to enjoy the fruits of the amnesty. Thousands of Poles remained stranded in the Soviet Union. Some were simply not released from camps and settlements. Many others were dealt further blows when freedom was only an arm's length away.
They let out a few families, amongst them me and my mother, only in November. We were going by an open lorry through a terrible snowstorm to Pawłodar, 225 kilometers. It was terribly cold, winter, blizzards. We reached Pawłodar and learned that they were no longer taking people into the Polish army, and we were left with no means to live, completely broken.
Following the Soviet amnesty, the Polish authorities carried out a census, which located only 1/3 of the estimated 1.7 million deportees. What was also strange and worrying was that not one of the 22,000 officers arrested in 1939 could be found. In April 1943, the advancing Germans announced the discovery of a mass grave in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. 5,000 bodies found in a ditch were missing officers, shot in the back of the head, their hands bound with wire, lying in layer beyond layer beneath the earth. The Soviets were outraged at Poland's request for an independent investigation by the International Red Cross. Accusing the Poles of aiding Goebbels' propaganda, Stalin broke off diplomatic relations with Poland. From now on, Poland's fate was in the hands of her British and American allies. But it was a delicate matter. The Soviets were now a new, badly needed ally of the West, and they could not be antagonized. Sir Owen O'Malley, the British ambassador to the Polish government, convinced Churchill and the Foreign Office that the responsibility for the Katyn massacre lay with the Soviets. And yet, despite the convincing evidence presented in his secret report, it was decided to bury the issue, for all intents and purposes, forever. Eden told the cabinet, "I did my best to persuade the Poles to treat the Katyn issue as German propaganda against the Allied war effort."
There can be no doubt at all that during the war, a number of people in the highest political circles in the United Kingdom were fully aware of the facts about Katyn and the Soviet deportations and other horrors. And a decision was made deliberately to mislead the public about those things. I think it's very difficult for people after 50 or 60 years to say, not that I made a mistake, but that our government was covering up the essential facts of history.
The odyssey of the Polish wanderers continued. They scattered all over the world in search of a new home. Over 110,000 Poles settled in Britain. Some spent their lives pining away for the green pastures of their childhood. Most, though, have become part of the fabric of British society. But even now, over 60 years on, their tragic memories are not acknowledged, their pain still unresolved. Out of necessity, they have had to reconcile themselves with their unacknowledged past.
No, we didn't get any compensation, any sorry notes or apologies. I'm happy, I'm alive, I value my life, and I'm here to tell the story.